Helen Whitmore thought her birthday would be special this year. When her children, Mark and Evelyn, told her they had a big surprise planned, she dressed up, her heart swelling with hope. But as the car stopped in front of a nursing home, her world shattered. They weren't taking her out to celebrate. They were getting rid of her to sell her house behind her back. But what they didn't know was that karma had already set its trap. What happened next left everyone speechless. Want to know what happened? Watch until the end and don't miss this emotional story full of twists. Tell us where you're watching from and subscribe for more. Helen Whitmore woke up with a rare sense of excitement. Today was her 76th birthday, and for the first time in years, her children, Mark and Evelyn, had planned something special for her. For decades, Helen had dedicated herself to raising them. After losing her husband, Robert, at a young age, she worked tirelessly to provide them with everything they needed. She sacrificed her dreams, her comforts, and even her own happiness to ensure theirs. But as the years went by, she noticed a painful change. Her children had grown distant. The warm visits turned into quick check-ins, and their voices on the phone lacked warmth. Yet today she chose to push those doubts aside. Evelyn arrived first that morning, holding a beautiful floral dress. "Happy birthday, Mum. I got you something special to wear. We want you to look your best today." Helen's heart swelled. It had been years since Evelyn had given her a present. Maybe, just maybe, things were changing. An hour later, Mark arrived. In his sleek black SUV, flashing his usual confident grin. "Big day, Mum. You're going to love this." Helen settled into the back seat, anticipation rising. Were they taking her to a fancy restaurant, a reunion with old friends, maybe even the beach she had always loved? But as the car slowed down in front of a gated facility with a sign that read Maple Grove Assisted Living, Helen's stomach twisted. This isn't a restaurant," she said, her voice trembling. Mark turned in his seat, his smile faltering. "Mom, we've been thinking. It's not safe for you to live alone anymore." Evelyn reached for her hand, squeezing it lightly. "We found the best place for you. You'll be so comfortable here." Helen's breath caught in her throat. "You're leaving me here?" Mark sighed as if exhausted. "Mom, it's for your own good, and for us too. We can't keep worrying about you all the time." Helen felt like the world had crumbled beneath her feet. They had tricked her. On her birthday. As she stepped out of the car, feeling smaller than ever, she made a silent vow. They thought they had won. They had no idea what was coming. Helen stood frozen at the entrance of Maple Grove Assisted Living, her heart pounding into her chest. The place looked pristine, too pristine. Manicured gardens, a large oak door, and smiling staff in pressed uniforms. But all she saw was a prison. "Come on, Mom, let's go inside," Mark said, placing a firm hand on her back. Helen wanted to resist, to run, to plead, but she knew her children well. She had seen this cold determination in their eyes before. They weren't here to discuss options. The decision had been made. As they entered, a woman with a tight bun and a clipboard greeted them with practiced warmth. "Mrs. Whitmore, welcome. We're so happy to have you." Mark and Evelyn quickly took over the conversation, signing papers and nodding at explanations about amenities, schedules, and healthcare plans. Helen barely heard a word. Her mind was elsewhere, searching for an escape. Then she saw it. A document. Mark handed over with an air of finality. It was a legal guardianship order. Helen's breath caught in her throat. They hadn't just sent her here, they had taken control of her life. "Wait," she said, her voice firmer than expected. "What is that?" Evelyn barely looked up. "Just some routine paperwork, Mom." But Helen wasn't fooled. She snatched the document before Evelyn could react, her eyes scanning the words. Declaration of Incapacity. Full guardianship granted to Mark Whitmore and Evelyn Carson. Her hands shook. You did this behind my back?" Mark crossed his arms, his patience thinning. "Mom, it's for your own good. We met with a doctor. He confirmed you've been forgetful. It's all legal. You can't live alone anymore." Helen felt the walls closing in. This wasn't about concern for her well-being. It was about power. She gripped the paper, her nails digging into it. "How dare you?" she hissed, her voice low but burning with fury. Evelyn sighed. "Mom, let's not make this harder than it needs to be. Everything is already settled." And that's when Helen understood. They hadn't just abandoned her. They had stolen her freedom. And there was only one reason they would go to such lengths. They wanted her house. Helen straightened her back. She might have been blindsided today, but she wasn't broken. Not yet. Helen sat in the quiet of her new room at Maple Grove Assisted Living, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The walls were painted a soft beige, the furniture sterile and impersonal. A small window overlooked the garden, where a handful of elderly residents sat in silence, watching birds flit between the trees. This wasn't home. It never would be. Her mind reeled with the reality of what had just happened. Mark and Evelyn hadn't just abandoned her. They had seized control of everything she owned. Her house, her bank accounts, even her medical decisions were now in their hands. Helen had always been sharp, perhaps sharper than her children ever gave her credit for. And right now she needed to be. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. A nurse peeked in. "Mrs. Whitmore, would you like to join the others for afternoon tea?" Helen forced a polite smile. "Not today, dear." "Thank you." The nurse nodded and left, closing the door behind her. Helen exhaled slowly. She needed to think. Then she remembered something. Something that sent a jolt of hope through her veins. She had seen this coming. Months ago, she had begun to suspect her. Children were up to something. The hushed phone calls, the rushed visits, the way Evelyn avoided looking her in the eye when discussing finances. It had all pointed to something bigger. So Helen had done what she did best. She prepared. She reached into her bedside drawer and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. Inside were names, dates, and most importantly, a contact. Margaret Reynolds, attorney at law. Margaret was an old friend, a smart, ruthless lawyer who specialized in elder abuse cases. And 3 months ago, Helen had signed a new set of legal documents in Margaret's office, transferring ownership of her home, not to Mark and Evelyn, but to a charitable foundation that supported elderly women in need. Mark and Evelyn thought they had everything, but they had nothing. Helen allowed herself a small smile. She wasn't going to fight them head-on. No, that would be foolish. Instead, she was going to wait because soon her children would realize their perfect little plan had a fatal flaw. And when they did, she would be ready. Mark and Evelyn stood in the grand foyer of their mother's house, surveying what they already considered theirs. The antique wooden floors gleamed under the morning light. The chandelier cast a warm glow over the space, and the scent of old books and lavender, a scent that had always reminded them of their childhood, still lingered in the air. But neither of them felt nostalgic. To them, this wasn't their mother's home anymore. It was an opportunity. "I already have a buyer lined up," Mark said, flipping through a stack of papers. "All we need to do is finalize the paperwork and we'll be set." Evelyn, leaning against the marble kitchen counter, exhaled with relief. "Good, we deserve this after everything we've put up with," Mark smirked. "And now we never have to worry about Mom again." They toasted to their success that evening, clinking glasses of expensive wine as they imagined the windfall coming their way. The house would be gone within the week and they'd be free, free from responsibilities, free from their mother's needs, free to enjoy the wealth they felt was rightfully theirs. But reality had other plans. The next morning, Mark arrived at the lawyer's office to finalize the transfer of ownership. He handed over the stack of documents, confidence oozing from his every move. The lawyer, a middle-aged man with silver-rimmed glasses, flipped through the pages, nodding as he read. Then, suddenly, he frowned. He went back a page, then another. Mark's smirk faltered. "Is there a problem?" The lawyer looked up, his brows furrowing. "Mr. Whitmore, you don't own this house." Mark let out a dry chuckle. "What? Of course I do. My mother—" The lawyer turned the papers toward him, tapping on a specific section. "Your mother transferred ownership 3 months ago. This property legally belongs to a charitable foundation. You and your sister have no claim to it." The words hit Mark like a physical blow. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Evelyn, who had just arrived and overheard the exchange, felt her stomach drop. That's not possible," she stammered. "She was declared legally incapable." The lawyer adjusted his glasses. Actually, that ruling was made after she transferred the house. The transaction is legally binding. I'm afraid there's nothing you can do. Mark clenched his jaw, his hands curling into fists. Evelyn shook her head in disbelief. I knew, she whispered. She knew what we were planning. For the first time, panic settled in. Their perfect scheme wasn't just falling apart. It had never been real to begin with. And their mother, she had outplayed them completely. Mark stormed out of the lawyer's office, his face red with fury. Evelyn trailed behind him, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. "This isn't happening," she muttered, shaking her head as if trying to wake herself from a nightmare. "There has to be a way to reverse it." Mark stopped in his tracks and turned to face her. "And how do you suppose we do that, Evelyn?" His voice was low, seething. "Mom already signed everything away. She outmaneuvered us." Evelyn swallowed hard. "Then we fight it. We'll go to court. We'll say she was coerced, manipulated." Mark ran a frustrated hand through his hair. "Oh, brilliant idea. Except, legally speaking, we've already declared her incompetent. Remember? That was our argument to take control of her finances in the first place." Evelyn's stomach twisted. He was right. They had built their entire plan on the foundation that Helen wasn't mentally fit to handle her own affairs. And now that very argument was locking them out of everything they thought they would inherit. Mark took a deep breath, his mind racing. "We need to talk to her," Evelyn scoffed. "Talk to her? After what we did?" "We don't have a choice," Mark snapped. "She's the only one who can undo this. If we can get her to sign something, maybe convince her she made a mistake." Evelyn hesitated. The idea of facing their mother, of looking into the eyes of the woman they had so cruelly betrayed, made her stomach turn. But the alternative? Losing. Everything was even worse. "Fine," she said, squaring her shoulders, "but we need to be careful. If she senses we're desperate, she won't budge." Mark gave a curt nod. "Then let's make sure we remind her exactly why she needs us." They climbed into Mark's SUV, the tension between them thick. Neither of them knew that this visit would change everything, because Helen wasn't just waiting for them, she was ready for them. Helen sat calmly in the garden of Maple Grove Assisted, living, sipping her tea as the afternoon sun cast golden hues over the neatly trimmed hedges. She had been expecting this moment, and right on cue she heard the hurried footsteps. Mark and Evelyn stormed toward her, their expressions a mix of desperation and frustration. "Mom," Mark said, forcing a tight smile. "We need to talk." Helen took another sip of tea, setting the cup down with careful precision. "Ah, my dear children, you finally remembered where I am." Evelyn sighed, sitting across from her. "Mom, please, we don't have time for this. We just found out about the house." Helen raised an eyebrow. "Oh? And what exactly did you find out?" Mark clenched his jaw. "Don't play games. We know you transferred it to a charity." Helen's lips curled into the faintest smile. "Ah, yes, the Eleanor Grace Foundation, named after my grandmother. A lovely organization, really. They help elderly women who have been abandoned by their families." Evelyn flinched at the last words. "Mom, you don't understand what you've done." "Oh, I understand perfectly," Helen said, her voice suddenly sharper. "I understand that my own children declared me incompetent behind my back. I understand that you tried to sell my house before my body was even cold. And I understand that now you're here because you lost everything you thought you were entitled to." Mark exhaled sharply, his patience running out. "Mom, look, what's done is done, but we can fix this. You just need to sign a reversal document. We'll make sure you're taken care of." Helen chuckled, shaking her head. "Oh, Mark, you still think I'm the same woman who used to make excuses for you? That I'll just nod and obey." She leaned forward slightly. "You may have taken away my home, but you underestimated me." Evelyn's hands curled into fists. "You're being cruel." Helen tilted her head. "Cruel? Cruel is sending your mother to a nursing home on her birthday, just to steal what she built." The words hung heavy in the air. Evelyn looked away, her face flushed. Mark, however, refused to back down. "Fine," he said, his voice lower now. "If you won't sign, we'll take this public. You think the media loves a poor, elderly woman betrayed by her kid's story. Just wait until we tell them you manipulated us. that you were losing your mind and transferred the house in a moment of confusion. Helen didn't flinch. Instead, she smiled. "Oh, Mark," she said softly, "you should really check the news." Mark frowned. "What?" Helen gestured to the large television mounted in the common area behind them. A news anchor's voice carried through the air. A shocking case of alleged financial exploitation where 2 adult children are accused of forcing their elderly mother into a guardianship scam to take control of her assets. Evelyn turned pale. "No." The screen showed their names in bold letters, photos of them laughing at real estate events, screenshots of bank transactions. Mark's hands curled into fists as a reporter continued. "We reached out to Helen Whitmore, the victim of this scheme, who bravely shared her story with us last week. Her legal team has already taken action, and authorities are now reviewing the case for possible criminal charges." Helen clasped her, hands together. "Now what was that about taking this public?" Mark and Evelyn were frozen in place. Checkmate Mark's face turned ghostly pale as he stared at the TV screen. Evelyn clutched the armrest of her chair, her breaths shallow and uneven. This isn't real," Mark muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "It can't be." "Oh, it's very real," Helen said, her voice smooth, almost amused. "You see, I may be old, but I am far from helpless. I made sure the world knew the truth before you had a chance to twist it." Evelyn's hands trembled as she reached for her phone. Dozens of missed calls, news alerts popping up one after another, messages flooding in from friends, co-workers, even distant relatives. All of them asking the same thing. "Is this true? Did you really do this to your own mother?" Mark, still staring at the screen, clenched his jaw so tightly a vein bulged on his temple. You set us up." Helen shook her head slowly. "No, dear. You set yourselves up. I just made sure the world saw who you really are." Evelyn turned to her brother, panic in her eyes. "Mark, what do we do?" Mark gritted his teeth. "Oh, we fight this." Helen let out a soft chuckle. "Oh, Mark, you still think you're in control, don't you?" She leaned back in her chair, crossing, her hands in her lap. "The media storm is only the beginning. My lawyer is already working on pressing charges for fraud and financial exploitation." Evelyn let out a sharp gasp. "Charges?" Helen nodded, her expression unreadable. "Oh, yes. It turns out the court doesn't take kindly to children who manipulate legal guardianship for personal gain, especially when it's based on forged medical records." Mark's body went rigid. "What do you mean forged?" Helen tilted her head. "Oh, you didn't think I'd just accept that diagnosis, did you? I had my own independent medical evaluation, done before you even filed for guardianship. Turns out I have a perfectly sound mind." Evelyn buried her face in her hands. "Oh my God." Helen exhaled slowly, shaking her head. "I knew something was wrong when you both started acting distant. I suspected something when I overheard your little conversation about taking care of things before it was too late. So I got ahead of you. I prepared. And now, everything you built your lies on is crumbling beneath you." Mark's breathing was heavy, his fists tightening. "This isn't over." Helen simply smiled. "Oh, but it is, and you'll soon see just how much you've lost." At that moment, Mark's phone rang. He hesitated before answering. It was his employer, and as he listened, his face fell. Evelyn's phone buzzed next, her husband. One by one, the world around them was unraveling. Helen watched them unshaken as realization dawned in their eyes. Karma had finally arrived. Mark's grip on his phone tightened as he listened to his boss's cold voice. "Mark, we've seen the news. This kind of scandal is not something the company can be associated with. We have no choice but to let you go. Effective immediately." Click. The call ended. Evelyn's phone slipped from her shaking hands. "No, no, no, no," she whispered. She had just read the text from her husband. "Evelyn, I can't be a part of this. You lied to me. You stole from your own mother. I want a divorce. I've already spoken to a lawyer. Don't contact me." Her vision blurred. "This can't be happening." Helen sipped her tea, watching them crumble. Mark slowly turned to face her, fury in his eyes. "You ruined us." Helen set her cup down gently. "No, dear, you ruined yourselves." Evelyn's breath hitched as she gripped the sides of her chair. "Mum, please." she whispered, desperation dripping from every syllable. We made a mistake. Helen tilted her head slightly. A mistake? No, darling. A mistake is forgetting to send a birthday card. What you did was a choice. A selfish, calculated choice. Mark clenched his jaw. So, what now? Are you just going to watch us lose everything? Helen exhaled, standing up slowly. Oh no, Mark. You still have one thing left. Mark and Evelyn exchanged nervous glances. Helen smiled. Each other. Mark's face twisted in disgust. Evelyn choked back a sob. Helen straightened her shoulders, a weight lifting off of her. I spent my life giving you love, and when I needed you most, you discarded me like an old piece of furniture. She gestured toward the TV where their names still flashed across the screen. But now the world sees you for what you are. She leaned in slightly, her voice lower, calmer. Enjoy the consequences. And with that, Helen turned and walked, away, leaving them sitting there, jobless, abandoned, and utterly humiliated. The past couldn't be undone. But Helen had taken back her power. And in doing so, she had ensured that they, the children who once tried to take everything from her, had lost far more than they ever imagined. As she stepped back into the warmth of the nursing home, a nurse greeted her with a kind smile. Would you like to join us for afternoon tea, Mrs. Whitmore? Helen smiled, feeling lighter than she had in years. Yes, she said, I think I'd like that very much. What do you think? Did karma serve them right? Let us know in the comments, and if you love stories like this, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. See you in the next one.